celebration, the suffering. It's quite a week for Jesus and his followers. A week that began with a parade and ended with a different kind of parade, a long walk to the cross. Back in November of 2006, my mom, who had been failing in health for the last couple of years of her life, had a birthday, and we decided we needed to have a big birthday party for her because it may well be her last. And so I flew, my daughter and I flew up from North Carolina, and my sister flew up from Sarasota, Florida, and aunts and uncles and cousins and everybody gathered that Saturday before Mom's birthday. She actually had had to leave their apartment at Clark Home the week before and go up to the third floor in full care nursing. But there she was in a wheelchair and there for the party, and what a grand time it was. All the family gathered. I flew back on Monday. My sister flew out Tuesday morning, and Tuesday night in her sleep, Mom died. She probably should have gone several weeks before, but she wanted to see her kids one more time. The will to live is amazing. I have seen time and time and time again in my ministry those that have willed themselves to live just a little longer, to wait to see family, to wait to have surgery, it's amazing. So it's tough to understand why someone would choose to die. Mark's gospel makes it very clear. It was Jesus' choice. The scene in the Garden of Gethsesame in Mark's gospel is long and full of agony. It's interesting how as time goes on, that vision changed. In Mark's gospel, you don't have any birth narrative. It's just Jesus at his baptism is the first you see him. And you have this long, painful decision in the garden about not wanting to go to the cross, and yet he decides to do that. And then a very short resurrection story. By the time Matthew comes along, we had a birth narrative, and the scene in the garden gets a little shorter, and the resurrection gets a little bigger, and then Luke comes along, and we have even a bigger infancy narrative, and a little bit shorter, although in Luke he does sweat drops of blood. But a little shorter in the garden and a little bigger on the other end, and then by the time you get to John, we not only have an infancy narrative, we have Jesus, the very Word of God at the beginning of time, through whom all things were created, the Word made flesh. And when you get to the garden, he doesn't even pray. He just comes in the garden, Judas shows up, and they take him away. It seems that over time, as the understanding of who Jesus was became more apparent, that this whole scene in the garden it's a little embarrassing. It's tough theology. Wait a minute. If Jesus, by the time we get to John's gospel, Jesus was created to die on the cross, so why would there even be a discussion about it? But in Mark's gospel, we get that more human side. That person who has led his people, has taught, has tried to appeal to the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees and the good conservative religious folk over there that want to maintain everything the way it is. And it hasn't worked. In his book, The Quest for the Historical Jesus, Albert Schweitzer describes Jesus in Mark is leaping upon the rock of fate and having turning and crushing him, which is, but rough imagery, but you really get that sense that Jesus really wanted things to be different. And I don't know about you, not being raised within the Jewish understanding of temple sacrifice and all those kinds of things. I have that same question that the choir just said. Why did he die? I'd have been a lot happier if he'd have stuck around and taught more. I'd like to have some of this stuff filled out a little bit. What did you mean by that? It'd be nice to ask those questions. And yet we know that sometimes, in some circumstances, it is necessary to sacrifice oneself for the good of others. Any soldier knows that. We see it repeated again and again in films and movies because it's a great theme. We understand the power of sacrifice. Because sacrifice is one of those moments when we overcome our own will to live. Because we place the value of others' lives over our own. We don't do that very often. One of the strongest instincts the Lord put in us is self-preservation. And it comes out in all different kinds of ways, individual and corporate. But there are times when we overcome that for the good of others. If I have a little film clip from Star Trek movie Wrath of Khan, where Spock goes down into the radioactive thing and fixes the engine so they can escape. And the wonderful line that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few are the one. When you think about that movie, it's really interesting because he saves them and then he's buried on the Genesis planet and is reborn. It's an old theme. It's a familiar story. Filmmakers use it all the time because we love the story. And yet in that scene, I know these are actors, but I still get a little tears when I watch that scene because Spock is sacrificing himself for the crew. But we know of other instances too. Parents who gladly give up their lives to protect their children. Soldiers who give up their lives to protect each other, their friends, their buddies. And yet Jesus would rather not have died, at least according to Mark. I don't know if you've ever read a book by Nikos Kazantzakis called The Last Temptation of Christ. If you've seen the movie and not read the book, please read the book. The movie was lousy. Well, in the book, the real meat of the book centers around this very scene in the garden when Jesus has to choose between the inevitable, if he keeps up what he's doing, because he knows that he's angered the religious authorities. He knows they're in cahoots with Rome. He knows that if he persists on doing what he's doing, God's will, he's going to get killed for it. And he has to weigh that against, just leaving the garden and going back to Galilee and being a carpenter and just being a normal person. Just not having to go through with all of this. And it's a tremendous internal struggle that we see therein in Mark's gospel. If there is any way, Lord, any way to do this different, let's do it different. Because he knew what was coming. Any person living in those days would know what it was to be crucified, because anytime there was any little trouble, thousands of political prisoners lined the roads, rotting on crosses. They knew what that was. The thing that really hits me about Mark's gospel, especially in the garden, is to believe that Jesus had a choice. Could have walked away, but he chose not to. He chose to do what the Father wanted him to do. He chose to follow God's will. And for me, that makes all the difference in my life. It also reminds me that sometimes when we choose to follow God's will, it may not be what some TV preachers say. You know, everything's going to be hunky-dory and peachy keen. And you're going to make all kinds of money and live well. You might end up on a cross. Our Christian brothers and sisters in many places in the world do regularly. Most places in India, they're still meeting stealthily in houses, because to be openly Christian in many places will get you beaten and killed. And we think we have it. Jesus made the hardest decision to make. To give up his life for ours.